Okay, I think we're good, right? Alhamdulillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillahi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Allahumma ya munawwir ya fattah. نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We begin in the name of God. We beseech him to send his peace and blessings upon our beloved Master and Prophet Muhammad, and upon his family, and upon his companions, and upon all of those who walk in his path of excellence until the last day. Alhamdulillah, we are in now the section on the Batiniya, the esotericists, or the Ismailiyah, in the text of Hujjat al-Islam, Abu Hāmid al-Ghazālī, rahimahullah ta'ala. And he's so far begun to lay out the issues within their particular methodology. He talked a little bit about it thus far by saying that this group has really resorted to a type of categorical taqlid. In other words, they're following in the opinion of an infallible teacher who they deem necessary in order for one to have knowledge of the religion. And he's beginning to show the types of flaws in that particular methodology, given that there are going to be emissaries that they have within the broad areas of the Islamic civilization who are going to have to, at some level, give their own opinions on matters. And when they're unable to consult with or get the answer from this infallible teacher, what are they going to do? They're going to have to resort to giving their own opinion on a matter. And the real issue here is that they're giving their opinion on a matter. They're giving ijtihad on this issue. And as he said, there is no real methodological approach to it. They don't know a methodology that allows for them in the capacity that they sit to be able to actually extrapolate those things. And so this is at the heart of the refutation that Imam Ghazali is actually trying to give. He's showing, and as a matter of fact, we do need an infallible teacher. So he actually grants that concept. He says we do need an infallible teacher. The only difference is we say that that infallible teacher is the Prophet Muhammad himself. And so using that same premise, but shifting the paradigm in a sense, he's now going about the refutation in a way that substantiates it as something that is going to be refuted. And so he continues. I think we reached the point here where he says, trying to show kind of the concept of, one who is going to be incapable of reaching the imam, for instance, to know what direction am I supposed to pray, what's the qibla, if I'm in the middle of the desert. Like if I'm in the middle of the desert, I don't know what the qibla is. So what am I supposed to do? Go to the imam in a completely different city? By the time that I go to the imam in a completely different city and ask that question, the prayer would have been gone, right? And so he's trying now to show all the different examples, okay, that are going to connect to the type of argument that he's concocting. فمن أشكلت عليه قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعني بعلومه في الدارين آمين. من أشكلت عليه قبلة ليس له طريق إلا أن يصلي باجتهاده إذ لو سافر إلى بلد الإمام ليعرفه القبلة يفوت وقت الصلاة. So basically what we just said, right? إذا جازت الصلاة إلى غير القبلة بناء على الظن ويقال أن المخطئ في الاجتهاد له أجر واحد وللمصيب أجران فكذلك في جميع المجتهدات. That's the example. You're going to miss the prayer. You have to suffice then with probabilistic knowledge or assumptive knowledge that is not to the degree of absolute certainty, but you have a high probability of understanding that this is probably the case. And he says when it comes to legal issues, that's what you're more than not going to end up having to do. And as a matter of fact, then he substantiates it within this legal maxim that says one who's wrong in their ijtihad, when it's a proper ijtihad, gets one reward, and the right one gets two rewards. And so this is actually the way in which all of the matters of legal opinions, unmediated, are actually going to be addressed. وكذلك أمر صرف الزكاة إلى الفقير. So now he gives another example. فربما يظنه فقيرا باجتهاده وهو غني باطنا بإخفائه ماله فلا يكون مؤاخذا به وإن أخطأ لأنه لم يؤاخذ إلا بموجب ظنه. So you give zakat to someone and you thought that that someone was poor. Like you thought that that individual met the conditions of a faqir, which, by the way, you know, Ramadan is only days away. Alhamdulillah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless our Rajab and Sha'ban and deliver us to Ramadan. And oftentimes people in the month of Ramadan, this is when they like to give their zakat, right? So just a reminder to myself and everybody that, you know, there are conditions to whom you give your zakat to. One should read up on, or at least have a basic knowledge of what are the conditions, and really try and put an effort into finding organizations who do have a proper means of accepting and then giving your zakat money to the categories that we all know. So what he's trying to say here is, look, if you gave your zakat to someone and you thought that that person was poor, in other words, you thought that they met the conditions of someone who is a faqir, you did your due diligence and that's what you saw, okay? And it actually turns out that that person is not poor, they're rich, and they were lying to you. Are you to blame for that? And like, have you not, as a result, fulfilled your duty because of that? He says, no, you've fulfilled your duty. You're not blameworthy for that particular action. And so this is, again, keeping in line with what he's trying to call us to. فإن قال ظن مخالفه كظنه فأقول هو مأمور باتباع ظن نفسه كالمجتهد في القبلة يتبع ظنه وإن خالفه غيره. فإن قال فالمقلد يتبع الشافعي أو أبا حنيفة أو غيرهما فأقول والمقلد في القبلة عند الاشتباه إذا اختلف عليه المجتهدون كيف يصنع؟ سيقول له مع نفسه اجتهاد في معرفة الأفضل الأعلم بدلائل القبلة فيتبع ذلك الاجتهاد فكذلك في المذاهب. ورد الخلق إلى الاجتهاد ضرورة الأنبياء والأئمة مع العلم بأنهم قد يخطئون بل قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أنا أحكم بالظاهر والله يتولى السرائر. أي أنا أحكم بغالب الظن الحاصل من قول الشهود وربما أخطئ فيه فلا سبيل إلى الأمن من الخطأ للأنبياء في مثل هذه المجتهدات فكيف يطمع في ذلك. So I'm going to try to move quick just so we can kind of get through this. So he says, look, he walks us through a kind of mock debate between this Batini method and the Sunni methodology. So basically he's saying here, what does a muqallid do if there's a difference of opinion between the mujtahids? So the Batini is kind of trying to corner him in to show the necessity of having some infallible teacher. So Imam al-Ghazālī says, well, what does the muqallid do in your situation in the middle of the desert where two mujtahids are telling him to pray facing two completely different ways? So then the interlocutor says he has his own personal opinion to make based on what he believes, given some type of evidence, okay, is the stronger position of the two positions being discussed. And so Imam al-Ghazālī says, okay, that's the same thing that we're doing in respect to taking from one of the two madhabs, whether it's Imam al-Shafi'i or Imam Abu Hanifa, as he states, you know, on a particular matter. That's what we're doing too, right? And it's substantiated. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Allah said, ask those who know. I do my best to find the person who specializes in that matter. I ask them, and as a result of which I've done my due diligence. In other words, unlike with matters of credo belief, which he's going to get to, the legal dimension or the practice, oftentimes they use the word praxis, the outward manifestations of my religion, does not necessitate that I myself have a firm understanding of the why that's involved in regards to the position itself. A specialist's opinion on the matter is good enough. So at the end of the day, legal matters necessitate a type of reason from me, in the sense that I'm trying to decipher who's the specialist to take from. Like, who amongst the different specialists that are out there should I take from their opinion? And who should I not take from? Like, who's not someone who I should go to for this particular type of matter? And hopefully, there's institutional support for those things. And we've talked about this on a number of occasions, but that's the reason why specialization is extremely important. The whole concept of fard kifaya in our tradition is about addressing that issue. Every individual in the community is obliged to put a sufficient amount of individuals, it could just be one individual, in these different sectors of the society in order that we're able to establish Muslim civilization. So there should be a Muslim doctor, series of doctors, and there should be Muslim lawyers, and there should be Muslim, grocery store owners, and there should be so on and so forth. All of these things become a necessity for us as a community to delegate, right? And people should be thinking about their role in terms of their career, their life work, so on and so forth, in a way that takes all of that into consideration. Like, I remember actually when I was first going to school, that wasn't on my radar at all. I wasn't thinking about what does the Muslim community really need right now. And it's interesting how, given that was my particular predicament, I was lost. I didn't really know what to do. And like many of us growing up in this country, you kind of like bounce back and forth. You're like in 5 different majors in a matter of like 1 year or something like that. And then the minute that I shifted, and, as a result of my studying religion and so on, I ended up thinking about, well, what does the Muslim community actually need? The minute that I thought about that, it was very easy. Doors opened, things made more sense, and I was actually able to progress in a manner that was much more rooted and grounded in a way that I was unable to see in the approach that I had taken before. So all of that is simply to say, look, we need people in different sectors of society. That should be something that's on our minds. And specialization is important. Now, one of the other matters that's important if we're talking about specialization is that we as individuals in the community recognize the specialists for their specialization. And we take from them on the merit of their specialization. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, that means, taken for instance, when we talk about going to a mufti or someone who is capable of issuing a religious edict to you. When you go to that person to ask them their religious opinion on a legal matter, and they're specialists in Islamic law, and they tell you their opinion on that legal matter, it's not proper decorum for you to then ask them, well, what's your dalil? That's actually why our teachers would tell us, ليس من الأدب أن تسأل ما الدليل للمجتهد. It's not of proper decorum to ask an authorized jurist, what's your evidence? I was on a bus once with a teacher of ours, and someone asked him for the dalil on an issue that he was talking about, and he said to the teacher, he said, "What's the hadith that you got that from?" Let's just say the response that he was given made it very clear that that's not a proper question to ask. Why? Why is it not a proper question to ask? Because you're asking them for methodological verification. You don't really realize what you're asking them for. You're asking them for, what's your methodological verification? And it's completely outside of your domain. It's an absurdity in many ways. In order for them to actually do that, do you know what that means? It means that you would have to have an extremely erudite understanding of the field. So you don't ask that to someone who's a specialist in the field. Like, we don't bring out an expert, for instance, in physics to help us understand neutrinos, and then first have him justify his methodologies before we can accept what he says on the matter. No, this individual is recognized as a physicist. He went to school. He's now, peer-reviewed and authorized in that capacity. What he says, we take as a specialist's opinion on a particular matter. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to believe or affirm the things that he's saying as like doctrine or something like that. No. But at the very least, you recognize that this is coming from someone who has that background. Okay. And so asking someone for their dalil in that sense, like, what's your methodological verification on this, is somewhat of an absurdity, because no one would know what that individual is talking about unless, of course, that individual themselves is either a specialist or has properly studied these things. Okay. Similarly, like a medical specialist. By the way, just as a footnote here, it's different to ask for clarification or to get like a basic breakdown on the matter to help you understand this. I go to the doctor, they give me a treatment plan based on whatever the diagnosis is. I'm trying to understand, like, I'm not questioning their methodology. I'm trying to understand, like, well, what exactly does that entail, for instance? Or to get more clarification on kind of what this is all about. That's different. But to assume that you would need to know the methodological underpinnings of the specialist's derivation before you took from them is absurd. As if you would be able to wrap your head around the technicalities of it all to understand like how they're actually arriving there. Okay. Like, why even have specializations anymore? That's the point. And again, clarification, getting different opinions, that's fine. But that's different than having a technical knowledge of the methodological approach being deployed to arrive at a given conclusion. And the reason why I'm like honing in on this is because we're living in a time period where people assume that it's simply as easy as logging onto YouTube and collecting some information from somebody who's doing it, like a DIY for everything. Like, just DIY religion and DIY medicine and DIY, the whole thing is DIY. That is not a proper foundation in terms of the way that Muslim civilization was being built. We recognized specialization. We honored people in the specializations that they had, and it didn't matter what they were. It wasn't just shuyukh. It wasn't just scholar of the community. Everyone was recognized in the capacity that they had, because they were all giving to the same purpose, and that was building Muslim life. Okay, so, again, an important concept for us to think about in the age of the internet. So all this comes back to methodology. All this comes back to methodology. In other words, a way that is consistent and it's coherent in its modality of understanding. And this modality comes from the prophets and the scholars, like those who inherited from the prophets, who were trained to exercise their own ijtihad, their own personal judgments. And it was known that they weren't going to be infallible in their understanding. They were going to make mistakes. And the religion itself accommodates that. And in fact, it elevates itself as a practical category because of that very reason. Like religious practice, fiqh, okay, and practicality thrive in pluralism. When you have a variance, it allows you to be able to address a variety of concerns. Versus theory, that's not something that thrives in flexibility and change and whatnot. No, it's actually the exact opposite. It thrives in the constants, those things that don't change. So if ijtihad is a process that is itself afforded to people who are not prophets, then the potential of mistakes exist within that particular framework. And so it becomes afforded to that very concept. Why? Because the jurists are not infallible. They may advise you actually to a wrong decision. And so when they advise you to something that's a wrong decision, what happens there? Are you wrong in adopting that position? Someone answer.
You wouldn't be.
You wouldn't be, right? You wouldn't be. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ said in المجتهد إذا أصاب له أجران وإن أخطأ له أجر واحد. The mujtahid who opines correctly receives one reward from God. And the one whose opinion is wrong gets one reward. So the religion that God revealed to his Prophet ﷺ took this matter into account from the get-go. It afforded that particular concept to be much more vast than people think. So if the mujtahid is presented a matter and on the basis of his understanding, on the basis of his or her knowledge of extrapolation, arrives at a particular understanding, they did their best. That's sufficient. Even if they were not able to say that this is like unequivocal, like this is absolutely certain. And that's why they say the domain of fiqh is dhann. It's probabilistic knowledge. It's not yaqeen. It's not absolute certainty. And if the matter upon which that jurist made his or her decision, if that matter changes, okay, now they become aware of something that they weren't aware of, and it's apparent that the opinion that that individual gave now was wrong, then that individual simply changes their opinion, and it's no problem in either case. That's it. Mish hikaya, as they say in Egypt, right? It's not an issue. We're all good. And it's okay because we're moving through that particular domain. Then he says, وَلَهُمْ هَا هُنَا سُؤَالًا. So here now he says we have, they're going to have two responses, or like two questions that they're going to pose to you. أحدهما قولهم هذا وإن صح في المجتهدات فلا يصح في قواعد العقائد إذ المخطئ فيه غير معذور فكيف السبيل إليه. This is really interesting. Okay. So they say, listen, if we grant that there can be differences of qualified opinions, well, that falls apart when we're talking about one's creedal foundations. Because if we did grant that the wrong opinion is not blameworthy, then how does one even qualify truth to religion at all? Do you get this? In other words, if this concept of multiple opinions, where the wrong ones are not blameworthy, is logically extended, it means that it's not a problem for people to choose religions other than Islam. Big problem, right? So how does Imam al-Ghazālī respond? And again, this is all kind of a part of his mock debate with the Baṭinī. Oh, okay. فأقول, so then I would say, قواعد العقائد يشتمل عليها الكتاب والسنة وما وراء ذلك من التفصيل والمتنازع فيه. يعرف الحق فيه بالوزن بالقسطاس المستقيم، وهي الموازين التي ذكرها الله تعالى في كتابه، وهي 5 ذكرتها في كتاب القسطاس المستقيم. Okay. So he says, Imam al-Ghazālī wrote a text to explicate how the intellect should be used, properly in order to discern between truth and falsehood. And this text is called Qisṭās al-Mustaqīm, the correct balance, the just balance. In other words, the text shows the proper method of intellecting, like reasoning from certainty. Okay. And so in the text, Imam al-Ghazālī actually discusses 5 rational criteria that one can use to arrive at certain truth. Now, these 5 rational criteria are the same things that we derive as principle in mantiq or logic as well. But Ghazali's overall aim in this text is to show, particularly the Baṭinīyah, that we as human beings have a personal mental capacity that was created in us in a particular way for a reason. And that reason is so that we can arrive at certain absolutes through the proper usage of our minds, of our intellects, which ultimately, one can say, mentally forces us to the divine. It ultimately forces us to recognize the existence of God and the divine in everything that's going on. Like, there's a reason why when I say something like X is 1 and X is not 1, your mind, there's something wrong there. So why is there something wrong there? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obviously created us. And so even that very concept of the inconceivability that I've just posited is a type of hujjah. It's a type of proof to something. So one has to think, well, okay, so why is my mind, why do we reject that? Why do we reject contradiction like that? Call it contradiction, okay? And are there other things that are sort of absolute in this sense that also continue to push us in a particular direction? It's forcing us in a particular direction, right? And so he's showing that this capacity of arriving at absolutes with the mind, first and foremost, is real. And then he goes on to connect this to the Quranic narrative in this text, Qisṭās al-Mustaqīm, and he uses the Quran to show that all 5 of these criteria that I'm talking about, where one is able to arrive at certain truth, all 5 of them are used in the Quran. Like, it's a Quranic narrative. So he uses language that makes it more palatable to the community in the sense that it's all coming from the Quran. And he writes this text, as I said before, as kind of a refutation of the Baṭinī methodology. And so he says, like, this is the text that one should go to, okay, in order for you to see how all of this actually works. فإن قال خصومك يخالفونك في ذلك الميزان فأقول, so if it's said, the Baṭinī will say, well, people who disagree with you, they differ obviously on this quote unquote criterion that you've set forth. So then Imam al-Ghazālī says, فأقول لا يتصور أن يفهم ذلك الميزان ثم يخالف فيه، إذ لا يخالف في أهل التعليم لأني استخرجته من القرآن وتعلمته منه، ولا يخالف في أهل المنطق لأنه موافق لما شرطوه في المنطق غير مخالف له، ولا يخالف فيه المتكلم لأنه موافق لما يذكروه في أدلة النظريات، وبه يعرف الحق في الكلاميات. Ghazālī replies, it's inconceivable that anyone would actually understand this criterion that I've set forth and then differ. Okay. In other words, it doesn't accommodate difference. It's a necessary truth. What is the definition of a necessary truth?
Well, necessary truth is something that corresponds to reality. If that we were to postulate something that negates it, then a logical contradiction must arise.
Good. So leave out the first part, the reality thing. Just start with the second part that you used. Okay? Say that again.
So if you were to postulate something that contradicts this necessary truth, then a logical contradiction will arise.
Well, now you said contradiction twice.
Oh, well, yeah. If you were to postulate something other than that truth, that necessary truth, then there must be a contradiction in the logic. Yeah.
Yes. If you assume it to be other than what it is, some contradiction arises. Okay. Can somebody give us an example of that?
So saying that a triangle does not have three sides. So saying triangle has four sides.
Right.
Or the sum of the angles is 200 degrees.
Right. It's inconceivable. And it's inconceivable because if you assume that it's the case, if you try and assume, okay, let's try and imagine a triangle that doesn't have three sides. What happens? Well, nothing happens because you're unable to conceive it. It can't be conceived. You can't actually do it. The mind won't allow you to go there. Okay, this is a very important concept, again, that Imam al-Ghazālī is drawing on here. And it's very important for those who try and talk about Imam al-Ghazālī as someone who does away with the intellect arriving at the truth claims of religion, right? Or that it somehow isn't capable of demonstrating truth. But ma'alina, different topic for different people, maybe. This particular concept is extremely important, okay? Because then he goes on to say to the Batini that a Batini like yourself won't reject it, because I actually show how I took all of it from the Quran. In other words, he's saying the same Quran that me and you both read explicitly goes through each and every single one of these criteria in the way in which I'm presenting it. So if you're rejecting this, then what are you actually rejecting? You're rejecting the Quran. Very strong argument. And he says, and the logicians won't reject it either, because it's actually in alignment with the laws or the principles of logic. This is really important because it shows that Imam al-Ghazālī is really trying to elevate the role of logic within the corpus of the tradition. And this is obviously something that is going to happen as a result of Imam al-Ghazālī doing such. And then he says, and the mutakallim, okay, the mutakallimun, the theologian, they won't differ as well on this issue, because it is in complete alignment with the different forms of inference that one can use to properly affirm religious truth. All right. Now, one last point and we'll move forward you can see here that he's showing you that the way in which the Quran presents these types of proofs, okay, are in line with the way in which the logicians and the different conditions that they have, okay, are able to arrive at certain types of truths, which is in line with the method of nazar that is used, the method of investigation or inference that the mutakallimun use in order to establish the veracity of religious truth claims. That's also an extremely important concept, given that, again, he's showing you how all of this is actually in alignment with one another. فإن قال, so if they say, فإن كان في يدك مثل هذا الميزان فلما لا ترفع الخلاف بين الخلق فأقول لو أصغوا إلي لرفعت الخلاف بينهم وذكرت طريق رفع الخلاف في كتاب القصاص المستقيم فتأمله لتعلم أنه حق وأنه يرفع الخلاف قطعا لو أصغوا ولا يصغون بأجماعهم بل قد أصغوا إلي طائفة فرفعت الخلاف بينهم. So then he says, the Batini will say, well, if you have this undeniable criterion that we're all, if we knew it, we would all be forced to accept it, then why are there still people who have differences with you? Pretty interesting, right? So then al-Ghazālī says, well, if they paid attention, they would have, right? And I actually would have been able to remove their disagreements. And I actually clarify, he says, I clarify how to remove this difference in the text, Qisas al-Mustaqim. So then he says, sit with that and sit with the text and think about it. Like really contemplate over it, and you'll see that it is the truth. And it does have this capacity to remove these differences. Problem is that very few people actually do that. And then he actually talks about, look, some of your former Baltani folks, they did in fact see it, and it did remove the differences. They did accept it. And this goes back to what we had talked about earlier in this course, right? And what he's going to try and, again, accentuate. Arriving at truth is not as hard as accepting it when you've arrived at it. And that's really the heart of the point that he's trying to make. وإمامك يريد رفع الخلاف بينهم مع عدم إصغائهم فلما لم يرفع إلى الآن ولما لم يرفع علي رضي الله عنه هو رأس الأئمة. So now he's showing, kind of extending on that point. He says, look, your Imam, the infallible source to you that unifies all of knowledge because he gives you the right answer all the time, even he hasn't been able to take away the differences that exist. Right? So in other words, people disagreeing on something being true is not proof that it's not true. Like, people disagreeing on a matter does not mean it's not true. This is a huge maxim. Everyone needs to write this down. People disagreeing on a matter does not mean that it's not true. Okay? And Ghazali says, even Ali, radiallahu ta'ala anhu wardah, even Ali could not escape differences in the community. And he says, and he's the lead imam, وَرَأْسِ الْأَئِمَّةِ. Okay? And so he, in a way, is accentuating this point for them and shows that agreement, again, is not necessarily an entailment of something being true or not. أو يدعي أنه يقدر على حمل كافتهم على الإصغاء قهرا فلما لا يحملهم إلى الآن ولأي يوم أجله وحصل بين الخلق بسبب دعوته إلى زيادة خلاف وزيادة مخالف. So he shows another issue with their belief about the Imam. He says, having a special power to entice people to the truth. It's not, you have this, but yet there are still people who differ. Like you haven't solved this problem. So disagreement here is something that is inevitable. It's going to stay. Like it'll always be around. Even the prophets themselves were unable to capture everyone's affirmation of them in the message, right? And at the end of the day, you know, even the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself, not everybody accepted what it is that he came with. Would we then be trying to say that what he came with must then have some sort of falsity to it? But a'udhu billah, hasha lillah. No. So at the end of the day, he says, look, your beliefs, as a matter of fact, have really created more divisions. نعم كان يخشى من خلاف نوع من الضرر لا ينتهي إلى سفك الدماء وتخريب البلاد وإيتام الأولاد وقطع الطرق والإغارة على الأموال وقد حدث في العالم من بركات رفعكم من الخلاف ما لم يكن بمثله عهد. فإن قال ادعيت أنك ترفع الخلاف بين الخلق ولكن المتحير بين المذاهب المتعارضة والاختلافات المتقابلة لما يلزمه الإصغاء إليك دون قسمك ولك خصوم يخالفونك ولا فرق بينك وبينهم وهذا هو سؤالهم الثاني. Okay, so now he says the second question is the following. They say, you claim that you can remove disagreements, but people do disagree with you. So basically, what is it that makes what you're saying right and what they're saying wrong? Okay. فأقول, so then I would say, هذا أولا ينقلب عليك فإنك إذا دعوت هذا المتحير إلى نفسك فيقول المتحير بما صرت أولى من مخالفيك. Okay. بما صرت أولى من مخالفيك وأكثر أهل العلم يخالفونك. So the Ghazali says the same deflection actually could be said to you, could be asked to you. Right? It could be asked to anyone, in fact. You know, those ascribing to your methodology are actually far less in number than people that are following a different methodology. So it could be asked, well, why do you think that you're right? And the majority actually disagree with you. Okay. So he flips it on them. He flips it on them and he kind of shows that this line of questioning is problematic. فليت شعري بماذا تجيب؟ أتجيب بأن تقول إمامي معصوم عليه إمامي منصوص عليه فمن يصدقك في دعوى النص وهو لم يسمع النص من الرسول وإنما يسمع دعواك مع تطابق أهل العلم على اختراعك وتكذيبك. So he says, if someone asks that question to you, what are you going to say? What are you going to say? Are you going to say that there's some nas, that there's some scriptural transmission that you have that affirms this claim? When where is that? There is none, actually. So now the only thing that you really have is that the claim is simply to be taken on your word. Okay. Then he says, ثم هب أنه سلم لك النص فإذا كان متحيرا في أصل النبوة فقال هب أن إمامك يدلي بمعجزات عيسى عليه السلام فيقول الدليل على صدق أني أحيا أباك فأحياه وناطقني بأنه محق فبماذا أعلم صدقه ولم يعلم كافة الخلق صدق عيسى عليه السلام بهذه المعجزة. ما شاء الله. So now he's saying, look, let's say that we can see, this is actually a really amazing, mashallah, proof. He says, let's grant that we concede, okay, on the scriptural evidence that you bring to us. Like, sure, okay, you brought us a nas and we're going to accept it, that your imam is the infallible imam. Okay. And then, you know, we're confused. So, you know, someone is confused about the basis of prophethood. And so that individual says, you know, they come to you and you say, look, the veracity of this claim of the imam's designation can be proven in the way that Jesus, alayhi salam, affirmed himself. In other words, there's going to be a miracle, right? So he says, the truthfulness of my claim of being the infallible imam is that I will bring your dead father back to life. And then he says, and then he does it. And the father rises from the dead and actually declares that this individual, this imam, is true. He's the imam. He is the imam. So Imam al-Ghazālī says, even if that went down, how could we then say that everyone is now obliged to recognize this individual as the infallible imam? When even the miracle that we know was attributed to Isa alayhi salam doing this was not the way that the entirety of the world became bound to accept the prophethood of Isa alayhi salam. You understand what he did here? Okay, good. So he's saying, look, you want to make a claim that this individual is the infallible imam. And so let's say, for instance, that we granted the particular nas that you have, the scriptural evidence that you have, and we kind of said, okay, well, you know, how would you show this? And so the imam says, look, I can prove it by doing a miracle in front of you. I'm going to raise your dead father from the grave. And then he does that, and the father comes out of the grave, says, yeah, he's the imam. Wow. Now that individual's like, yeah, that's amazing. Okay. Even if we did grant that incident did happen, Imam al-Ghazālī is saying, how does that then obligate every Muslim who didn't see that to accept that particular claim as well, that this person is the imam? You couldn't actually say that because it was an experience that this one individual had, right? And similarly to the way that we come to identify Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, as a messenger and prophet, alayhi salam, we're not actually affirming Isa's prophethood in the way in which it was affirmed to those individuals who were with Isa, who saw him perform that miracle, bringing the dead back to life. We didn't see that. So it couldn't be that miracle that somebody is claiming that we have never seen, which becomes the reason, right, why we also accept that particular claim. You understand what I'm saying now? Okay. So it's not why we accept, you know, Isa's prophethood today. We accept that Jesus is the messenger, right? And a prophet, alayhi salam. But we believe it because Revelation clearly states it. And we were able to, as all human beings living today, are able to arrive at the veracity of Revelation. We actually can qualify that this revelation is true. So even that method, okay, that the Batiniya would try to resort to, Imam al-Ghazālī is saying, is insufficient in rendering compliance to this doctrine from everyone. That's the main point that he's making there. بل عليه من الأسئلة المشكلة. ما لا يدفع إلا بدقيق النظر العقلي والنظر العقلي لا يوثق به عندك ولا يعرف دلالة المعجزة على الصدق ما لم يعرف السحر والتمييز بينه وبين المعجزة وما لم يعرف أن الله لا يدل عباده وسؤال الإضلال. So let me pause for a second here and go back. بل عليه من الأسئلة المشكلة ما لا يدفع إلا بدقيق النظر العقلي والنظر العقلي لا يوثق به عندك ولا يعرف دلالة المعجزة على الصدق ما لم يعرف السحر والتمييز بينه وبين المعجزة. So this is an extremely poignant point. Okay, may not be able to get through everything. This is an extremely important point, though, in understanding al-Ghazālī's point of view on the intellect and the methodology. Okay, he says, look, in continuing from the last point, we accept that Jesus alayhi salam is the messenger because we're able to arrive at the veracity of revelation, right? Okay, how did we arrive at the veracity of revelation? Somebody answer that question.
Is that because of legal judgments?
Well, we derive legal judgments from the revelation, but how do we come to the conclusion that, yeah, this revelation, it's legit? This is real. This is really from God.
The rational judgments?
Good. Perfect. We got there through reason. We got there through pure reason. The unmediated intellect got us there. Which goes back to the notion that he's talking about in what he listed in the text that he referenced, Qisas al-Mustaqim, okay, the correct balance. He says, look, the intellect and proper modes of analysis are real methods to allow one to arrive at necessary truths. And the pinnacle of all of these truths is the existence of God, his attributes, and then the possibility of his sending prophets, and then establishing the veracity of the Prophet ﷺ, which brings us to revelation. Because when we establish the veracity of the Prophet ﷺ, then what he brought, i.e. the Quran, is something that we then completely affirm as coming from this divine source. And once we arrive at revelation, we're also given now a complete picture of reality, of those things which our use of pure reason was going to be unable to properly conclude. This is the harmony of reason and revelation. So based on this, we would say, as Ahl Sunnah, it's not permissible for us to say that a religious person does not have concern for the intellect, or that religious doctrine is not something that has to, we don't come to the conclusion through the use of pure reason. No, religious truth is based on the intellect. And what do I mean by that? Okay, so people don't twist my words here. It doesn't mean that religion is formed by the intellect. It means that religion establishes its veracity through the intellect. It means that the religion that is stipulated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and establishes itself as the truth is done so by means of the human intellect. That's what is meant by the statement of Ahl Sunnah when they say the means of knowing al-ma'arif is by the intellect, and al-ahkam, the rulings, are by the sharia. And the means of knowing in ma'arif, these things are like what? These things are like God exists, and that he's one, and that he's powerful, etc. We went through this in the theology course. And a part of this understanding is that the human being can know these things without having revelation. I can know that God exists, and that he can't have a beginning, and that he can't have an end, and that he's unlike his creation, and he's self-sufficient and one with the intellect. I don't need revelation to verify that. I can get there through the use of the intellect. The only caveat to this is that we would say it's not obligatory for the human being to believe in these things, i.e. to take them as their deen, where you're held liable for your lack of these beliefs in the afterlife until after the Sharia has been revealed to you. Okay, so the mutakallim, the mutakallimun, the theologians of Ahl Sunnah refute the claim actually that reason is counter revelation, or that the two undergo some sort of process with one another. Pure reason, it affirms revelation. And what the theologians of Ahl Sunnah claim is that there are certain assents, certain confirmations, tasdiqat, like the existence of God, which could not be dependent on revelation, because something which you know through revelation can only be known to be true once you've demonstrated the existence of God and the veracity of the prophethood. Okay. Now, what does Imam al-Ghazālī want to show by introducing all of this? He's saying, and pay attention here, he's saying to the Batiniyah, you all believe that there is no way to knowledge except by revelation, affirming the infallibility of this Imam that we then take from. But how did you know he was infallible? It was through the intellect. Like, you had to get there through the intellect first, which now shows that your methodology has a contradiction, a fundamental contradiction, an absurdity, because you do actually have a way of arriving at knowledge without the Imam, and it's dependent on your arriving at that conclusion, okay? But then you negate it after you've arrived at it. Everybody understand that point? Okay.
So
we'll end on this, inshallah, and, you know, alhamdulillah, we move slowly, but again, that's just part of the nature of having to do this with me. So someone had a comment. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah. Alaikum salam.
Yeah. So I didn't get that last point where you mentioned that Batinis, according to Imam al-Ghazālī, the Batinis, in order to arrive at just accepting that there is an infallible Imam. So he's talking about making that claim. They get to it through using reason, because they believe that someone must be at any given point guiding, someone who's perfect, guiding people in every single generation. Is that because, and is that what he's referring to?
Yes.
Okay.
Which is a claim that seems to quote with it. Yes. I'll just leave it at that. And he's going to expand on it too. I just didn't get a chance to, go through the whole thing. And it has to do with the fact that, one being able to properly decipher between what is a miracle and what is not a miracle, which is actually still an issue even until today in the way that people think about this concept. Mm-hmm. Right? Somebody who comes down and says, and he talked about this already in the text. Somebody comes down and says, Mayid, listen, 10 is not greater than 3. And here's my proof. And then I, I'm able to let go of this cup, and then the cup stays here, and then I make it vanish. Imam Ghazālī says what? He says, look, the only thing that an individual should do if something like that happens is look at that person who did this thing, who did this trick, basically, and say, man, that's crazy. How did you do that trick? But in no way should you ever feel like 10 is somehow actually less than 3. There's no miracle that would substantiate you denying that necessary truth. And this is a very powerful capacity that the human being has been given, if you recognize that, right? That capacity that you've been given allows you to decipher these things properly. And so what he's saying is, you're making these claims to being, we should be following an infallible teacher based on your sourcing it through nas coming from the religion itself. And that real knowledge, the only type of real knowledge that one can have comes from that source. So then he says, well, how did you get to that source to begin with? You got to that source by means of the intellect. The intellect had to bring you to the veracity of the Quran being, the Quran, the Prophet, Allah's existence, the Prophet, and the Scripture. So, as a matter of fact, you are accepting that the intellect does have the capacity to take you into this type of knowledge, real knowledge, and you can arrive at that through the intellect alone. And then once you arrive there, what you're saying now is there's no real knowledge except for what comes from this infallible source, this Imam. So there's a huge issue in the way that model, that particular method that is being used.
I have a follow-up question. I think, one of the objections that Imam al-Ghazālī mentions about how, an infallible Imam will make some sort of miracle to an individual person to show them that they are indeed in the truth and that they are an infallible Imam, right? Now,
can you say that again, because you cut.
So he mentioned that the way they could prove, or the way when he made the parable with Isa alayhi salam, say if an Imam wants to come or someone who claims to be an infallible Imam and perform a miracle in front of you to convince you. Now, right. You mentioned that that doesn't bind the individuals or the people that didn't see it, because that cannot be used as proof against them. Now, because one of the things that we, as I understand in Sunni Islam, we conceive of the Prophet ﷺ as being a prophet, or we accept his prophet, who is one of the reasons being is because he was able to perform miracles that, we can verify through mutawatir traditions as well, because these are things that were shared by so many people in so many different times, and there's just so many chains of narrations that just agree with the same conclusion, and thus we can, have a high level of certainty that this indeed took place. And we also know that, that he's truthful and that he's honest, and, and the other conditions that a prophet must have, right?
Yeah, well, so those are the things, So the miracle, mu'jiza, which literally means to render incapable, or that which incapacitates, it indicates the truthfulness of the person claiming prophethood, and it has certain conditions. Okay, the first one, the one that everybody knows, is that it breaks the norm of customary convention. Okay, so there are customary causes and customary effects. We know them. These are two distinct phenomena that are not impossible to conceive of not happening together, though. Okay, and there's a particular typology that's given by our ulama in order for us to understand how these two things will connect with one another. So like fire and burning and so on and so forth. When those things that we know, okay, as being patterns that the world works through, like fire and burning, like if I put my hand in fire, it'll burn, so on and so forth. When that doesn't happen, when the effect that we know to happen doesn't happen, that's what we call kharq al-'ada. There's a break in the norm. That's the first thing, okay? Now, this miracle, this break of the norm occurs with a claim to prophethood. So someone needs to claim that they are a prophet. So like, I'm saying, the Prophet ﷺ came and said, I am a prophet and my sign or miracle is XYZ. Okay. And then that happens in accordance with how they claim that it was going to happen. And we actually do see the break in the convention going down. Musa alayhi salam comes down and splits the sea. Okay. Claiming that I am here as a representative of God himself, like as a prophet, as a messenger. So those are the two things that happen, the break in the norm. Second thing is that it occurs with the claim to prophethood. And the third thing is that that miracle is accompanied with a challenge. It's, there's a challenge put forth wherein which the prophet who actually does it, obviously by the leave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, says that this is inimitable. This is not something that can be reproduced by someone else. All right. That particular point, when we talk about it in relationship to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, okay, what is the Prophet's miracle then for us?
Well, the main one is the Quran.
The Quran. Okay.
I mean, that's the only one we actually have access to, live.
Exactly. The Quran is the miracle. And on the basis of that, you are able to come into an understanding of this aspect of the substantiation of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, what you're talking about is also something that can be looked at. Many people have. One of Imam al-Razi's proofs of the Prophet ﷺ, which was reiterated later after him, was that the Sahaba and the generations that followed the Prophet ﷺ and the spread of Islam is itself a proof of his prophethood. Does that make sense? Like, one could look at that and also recognize that this is a huge matter. And, so on and so forth. But the real claim, okay, in terms of the miracle for the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and why we would still regard that an individual is able to verify the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, is primarily because of the Quran.
So
it's available, one can access it and verify it.
So then the reason why then we don't believe on an infallible imam or the Batini's understanding is because we believe that from the textual proofs, is it because there's the prophet is the last prophet also, and infallibility cannot be found in humans, or what?
Yeah, it's that methodology. Okay, it's that sort of methodological point that tries to say, in order for us to come into an understanding of the religion properly, one must have an infallible source that is not simply just the Prophet ﷺ himself, but those who come after him as well, that are able to represent the opinions that are needed in order for one to decipher what the religion is saying, who are themselves infallible. Versus the approach that Ahl Sunnah came with, which was that no, it's actually a methodology that was something that the Prophet ﷺ himself instantiated in the Sahaba, and whom the Sahaba gave to the Tabi'een, and whom the Tabi'een gave to the Atba' Tabi'een, so on and so forth until today. And we know that that role was given to the ulama, and that this tradition is alive because of it. And insofar as our credo beliefs are concerned, these are things that are absolute, and they're absolute because, as Imam al-Ghazālī says, read Qisṭās al-Mustaqīm, right? You will see that there are criteria that allow for us as human beings to arrive at the absoluteness of a thing. And all of our primary credo beliefs are things that can be substantiated as yaqeen, things that derive out of necessary truths. But then in terms of the practical matters of the religion, which entail, legal issues, those things, they don't need to be yaqeen. And there are methods, that we have in order to still extrapolate from the sources what is the answer to this particular concept. How do we practice our religion given a particular circumstance or whatever? But I don't need to have absolute certainty in order for me to practice these things. And if the mujtahid gave an opinion that, as we said before, is not right, and we find out later that, hey, there are some different elements to this whole ordeal that need to be taken into consideration, and we change the opinion as a result of which, all of that is okay. All of that is accommodated or afforded by the religion in the way that the religion was set up by the Prophet ﷺ himself. And as one sees it in that light, they begin to realize that all of this is very consistent and a coherent presentation of the sources that we still have till this day, and how one can come into a proper understanding and embodiment of this religion. So that it's that methodology, that manhaj, which is why, this concept is extremely important, particularly here at this institution, the Majlis, and why we stress it so much and why we continue to read from the type of text that we read from, is because all of it should be giving you a proper methodology of understanding your religion and how the different aspects of your religion connect to one another. And it becomes now a holistic thing rather than something that is one-dimensional or, where the connections are not consistent and it's kind of haphazard, and it's not actually bringing about the type of lived reality that we read about when we read, for instance, the lives of these great people in our tradition, men and women, that go all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ himself and his legacy and what that looked like.
So yeah, that's I think that's where that clarifies it a lot for me, because understanding that methodology of ijtihad must exist, saying that there is an infallible imam at all times kind of contradicts or doesn't even give room for ijtihad in a way, or the methodology has been constructed to understand the deen and apply the deen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's the main point that he's going to continue to try to make. It'll come together as soon as we finish, but he's really saying, look, this trajectory that they're on, the Batiniyya, is one of absolute taqleed. And that is because the entirety of the methodology is rooted in simply asking the infallible teacher to give you the answer. That's the only way that you can actually come to knowledge of the religion. And he says, and the problem with that is that there are inevitably going to be scenarios where that's not possible. And as a result, you don't have now a way to methodologically deduce the answers for yourself. And so even if they're doing it, which they're going to be forced to do it in certain situations, there's no methodology, because the whole methodology was what?
Just the one person.
Go to that one person.
Dictating it, yeah.
Go to that one person, right? The Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, did not do that with his Sahaba. And it's for this reason. So that's our argument, and we're sticking to it. Alhamdulillah. Barakallah.
وفيكم بارك الله.
We will see you all next week, and keep us in your dua. I'll keep you in mind, and inshallah we get to see all of you soon. I would say everybody's name and say everybody. Thank you for those of you who turned on the cameras. And yes, as Firas asked, this is Gatorade. I ended up putting Gatorade in this tea cup. It's really good. So.
It was modernism.
All right. Assalamu alaikum.